Hi everyone, it's Miss Haig here. I hope you're all keeping safe and well. Today we're going to be working on skills around our written responses, so our essay work. We're going to focus on contextualizing evidence. Now this is something that's incredibly important to do, but often students find it quite difficult to do and therefore they avoid it. That can lead to a couple of pitfalls. Either a student provides a piece of evidence and then the analysis demonstrates that they don't really have much of an idea of or an understanding of how it fits in with their question, or they produce a functional paragraph that does what it needs to do, but it's not as developed or sophisticated as it could be. Now, it goes without saying that when you're writing an essay, you have to be well prepared. You have to have planned. Okay, so bear that in mind, please. Planning is essential. We're talking about a specific essay skill. So we are going to be answering 3 questions when we are working through this presentation today. Number 1, we're going to be looking at the difference between contextualizing evidence and including context, which you know is an explicit section on your P2C paragraph structure. So whether you've been using P2C, Peter or Squirt paragraphs, it's explicit. We're going to look at the difference between the two so that you don't get confused. We're also going to look at why it's so important to contextualize evidence. And then finally, we're going to talk through and demonstrate some steps that will help you with that contextualization. Now, it's important to note that at first you will have to do this consciously, but the more practice you get in, the more automatic this will become. And we want it to be automatic. We don't want you to have to spend ages thinking about this. So, is there a difference between contextualizing evidence and including context? Well, the obvious answer is yes. However, both work on the same principle. We have the idea that elements around a text, a quote, or a word have influence on its meaning and its impact. And that's what we're going to be looking at. Now, we've got 2 definitions of context. The first, the parts of a written or spoken statement that precede or follow a specific word or passage, usually influencing its meaning or effect. And the second, a set of circumstances or facts that surround a particular event or situation. Now, you are most familiar with the second definition of context, and this refers to context. We've always asked you to include context in your paragraphs and in your essays, and when we ask you to do that, we're asking you to think about the effect and the impact of historical events on a text, the impact of culture, rituals, or other social norms on a text, the impact of language, and the impact of the genre the writer is using. Now, if we take Of Mice and Men as an example, it's imperative for us to understand and recognise the events of the Wall Street crash and the Great Depression in order to understand the world of the text. It's important for us to understand other social elements, such as the world of itinerant workers, the role of women, the issue of racism at the time. It's important for us to understand that there will be slight language differences, and that is reflected in the use of slang. And it's important as well for us to recognise that Steinbeck is writing a tragedy and the impact that that has on the text itself. So you were all very familiar with that, and no doubt you have done work on that with regard to Of Mice and Men. The first definition refers to what we are looking at though, contextualizing evidence. And we need to look at different things in order to do this well. So we have our quote. We need to think about what's happened before that quote, what happens after, and also the mood of the scene. So essentially, we're looking at exactly what is going on, because that can have an impact on what our quote actually means or its effect on the reader. So that is the difference between the two. Context is broader than contextualizing evidence. So it's important to contextualize our evidence for a few reasons. Our exam board uses assessment objectives, and you will become very familiar with those as you move through GCSE. I want to look at two particular assessment objectives. The first one being AO1, and that refers to the understanding of task and whole text, and also the use of textual references to support and illustrate interpretations. So when we're thinking about the understanding of the task and the whole text, contextualizing our evidence can help demonstrate and advance our understanding, and therefore help us pick up marks. And then it can also help us with selecting our evidence in the first place. If we want to accurately support and illustrate interpretations, we have to make sure that our textual evidence is completely appropriate and that it's judicious, it's well judged in its application. Understanding exactly what's happening within that quotation helps us do that. We also need to think about AO2, analysing the language, form and structure used by a writer to create meanings and effects using relevant subject terminology. Now, I'm sure most of you are able to identify the technique that's been used by the writer. You can use the subject terminology. But if we are contextualising our evidence, it can lead us to build layers of understanding. It can help us recognise patterns that the writer is using, and it can help us build in multiple interpretations to a particular quote, which is incredibly important. Now, the literature mark scheme in particular is split into 6 sections, or 6 levels, and levels 5 and 6 require you to provide a developed response, select judicious textual references, and examine the reader's reaction and the writer's intentions. Contextualizing our evidence can really lend a hand to achieving those things. So let's start having a look at how we can approach this. Now, this is the quotation I want you to bear in mind when we are looking at the rest of this PowerPoint. It's from chapter 1. George is trying to warn Lenny to stop drinking the water in the pool. So it says, "Lenny," he said sharply, "Lenny, for God's sake, don't drink so much." Now let's have a look at how a couple of students have used that quote. I'm going to show you the evidence and then the analysis, the technique and the exploration. So this is the first one. It says, "This is shown in the quote, 'Lenny,' he said sharply." The use of the adverb sharply shows that George is angry with Lenny. Now, it starts off okay. We've got our quotation there. We've got the adverb sharply, and this student has recognised that perhaps suggests George is angry with Lenny. Indeed, sharply does mean being abrupt or cutting or angry. But my question would be, is that the picture Steinbeck wanted to create? And I'm not entirely sure it is. So this is an example of a student perhaps missing the idea or missing the point that the writer wanted to convey. We then have a slightly different interpretation. So again, we've got our quotation, slightly extended this time, and it says the use of the adverb sharply and the repetition of Lenny's name shows that George is trying to get Lenny's attention urgently. Now, that is a perfectly serviceable paragraph, or it's part of a perfectly serviceable paragraph. It does exactly what it says on the tin, but I would suggest that this is an example of a paragraph that is underdeveloped. This student could do so much more if they look into that quotation and that language a little more closely. So that is what we are going to do now. I've got my quotation again. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to think of my 3 steps for improving my contextualization of this quote. I'm going to think about what happens before this quote, what happens after this quote, and I'm going to think about the mood of the scene. So, what happens before this quote? Well, just before this quote, Steinbeck tells us that the pool was green, so it doesn't seem very fresh, doesn't seem to be running. That could potentially mean there's a lot of bacteria, that it's quite dangerous to drink. He also tells us that Lenny dropped his blankets and flung himself down to drink, and that he was snorting into the water like a horse. So Lenny was clearly very desperate for water, and he's clearly enjoying his drink. He's not even giving himself time to take a breath if he's snorting into the water. He's enjoying himself. So that perhaps suggests Lenny was incredibly desperate. He got himself a drink, maybe without thinking about those signposts that we all take into account when evaluating whether something is safe or not. Lenny didn't do that, he just went for it. So that's what happens before this quote. After, or directly after, George warns Lenny that he might get sick. That's his qualifier for commanding Lenny to stop drinking the water. So that's telling us that he wants Lenny to be safe. And we learn that caring element continues. As the chapter progresses, we see that George looks after Lenny's work card. He gets him his tea. He makes sure that he knows of a safe place to hide if he gets in trouble. So that's telling us that George is coming from a place of care, which is why we have this command. And then finally, if we look at the mood of this quotation, and sharply in particular, at first that seems quite aggressive and angry, as does for God's sakes, that blasphemy. But when we put that with what happens before and what happens after, we could argue that there's a sense of urgency, and that's coming from a place of care. George cares about Lenny and doesn't want him to be in danger, so he's trying quite urgently to get his attention. So, now I have zoomed in on my quote, I've contextualized it by thinking about what happens before, what happens after, and the mood. I can then go on and have a look at how I would develop my paragraphs. Now, I've taken the more developed paragraph that we saw in the previous slide. This is by a student, and I want to start by improving this and improving the bold red in particular. This student has followed some sentence stems, and they've used the phrase or the clause, "This is shown in the quote." Now, again, it's a perfectly serviceable introduction to a quotation, but this student could develop their answer so much further to show their understanding of the text from the outset, that AO1. And so what I did is I took my understanding of that quote based on what happens before and what happens after. I'd recognised that George was attempting to warn Lenny, and so I've introduced it in that way. Instead of saying this is shown in the quote, I've said, when attempting to warn Lenny about drinking the water, George states. And by doing that, I am allowing my reader, be that another student in the group, a teacher, or an external examiner, to understand exactly where my piece of evidence is from, what is happening at that time. That's incredibly important. I am demonstrating to my audience an understanding of the text in relation to the task. And I've done all of that before I even use my quotation. But that's not all I could do. Let's go back to the quote again. Now, our students in the previous exemplars both zoomed in on the adverb sharply. And so that's what I'm going to do. Now, we said that that adverb, along with the blasphemy, for God's sakes, seems very aggressive and angry. So George could be very frustrated with Lenny. But it also, when we put it in the context of what happens before and after, shows a sense of urgency coming from a place of care and concern. George doesn't want Lenny to become ill. He doesn't want Lenny to be in danger, and therefore that mood is one of care but a sense of urgency, possibly of desperation if Lenny's not listening. So, I'm going to now develop in green. This student has written the use of the adverb sharply and the repetition of Lenny's name shows that George is trying to get Lenny's attention urgently. Again, it's perfectly serviceable, but I can develop it further using that work that I've already done on the quote. So I'm going to look at how you can interpret this in different ways. I've talked about the surface level. So Steinbeck's created a sense of aggression, suggestive of George's frustration with Lenny's lack of awareness. We know that the pool is dangerous, or potentially dangerous because it's green, and we know that Lenny's not bothered with any of that. So perhaps George is frustrated, and maybe there is an aggressive tone to those words. But then I've talked about the second interpretation I picked out, based on my contextualization. So, however, this could also be interpreted as a sense of urgency and desperation from a need to keep Lenny safe, therefore indicating George's love and care for his friend. So there, I've been able to really advance this student's understanding of the text and advance my understanding of that quotation. I've taken everything I learned when I put that quote into context, and I've thought about what that shows me about the characters and their relationship. It also provides me with a great opportunity to link to a second quotation. And remember, I shouldn't make broad sweeping statements based just on one quote. I need to link, I need to look at patterns that are built, how the same idea is developed in different ways across the text. And by using this quote, I know that I can do that. I've done my contextualization. I can quite easily select a second quote that reinforces and builds upon the first. So that's how I look at using contextualization to improve my evidence and therefore my written work. I hope that has been helpful, and I will speak to you all soon.